Hey everybody, Jason Burmis here, and we are very, very fortunate to have one of my favorite writers, especially on the subject of Jeffrey Epstein and the deeper intelligence connections. One of the reasons that this case, number one, has been so important to me, two, will continue to be so important to me, and three, we need to get the network. You know, we're talking about a new investigation now going on in Europe. They raid the mansion, yet Ghislaine Maxwell, Jean-Luc Brunel, Leslie Wexner, Leslie Groff, Sarah Kalin, all of these people still have not been arrested. And Whitney Webb, she went over three of her amazing four-piece, but there's a fifth piece too you really need to read as well. And we're going to try to go over not only the crescendo of her Epstein network investigation, but also how it bleeds into current surveillance tech, especially with apps like Carbine, U.S. Israeli intelligence. You're going to get it here first, but to start it off, why don't you tell people where they can find your work and read these excellent articles, because they're not for the faint of heart. This isn't BuzzFeed nonsense where there's like
No.
a splash page and, pictures of ridiculousness associated with nonsense. This is real hardcore journalism. So where can they read it? And what inspired you, by the way, to get involved in this series in particular before we go off?
Oh, okay. So all my stuff you can read at mintpressnews.com. If you go to the main website at mintpressnews.com, you just scroll down below the top story. There's a link that will take you to the entire Jeffrey Epstein series. The 4-part series, which is about the Epstein network. The part 5, which is really not really technically part of the series, it's a spinoff. You can find that by going to my author page, or you can just type in the search bar CIA, Mossad, and Epstein, and it'll be the first one to come up. And beyond that, what got me started on this series initially, I'm not sure if I mentioned it the last time I was on. I originally wasn't going to write about it, but decided to after it was revealed that Alex Acosta said the reason that he had backed off pursuing Epstein to the full, more full, I guess, extent of the law, was that he had belonged to quote unquote intelligence, and I was interested in trying to figure out what intelligence agency that was, or if it was multiple intelligence agencies, and trying to look more into the history of Epstein pre-2000s, really, to see what was there, if there were any obvious ties there, which there, of course, are. And, what's interesting is that a lot of the mainstream media coverage about Epstein, it really only starts when they look into his past, with some, a couple exceptions, maybe like Vicky Ward, for example, who went further back. Most of them start, around the year 2000 or 2001. And up to his first arrest and beyond that, they don't go back into what he was doing really in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I mean, a little bit, you'd get some articles, that talked about him at the Dalton School and things like that, but it wasn't the focus of most of the mainstream reporting.
So let's then just dive right into it, right? BCCI banking, something most people are not familiar with. And I really want everybody to watch our first interview together where we talk extensively about the Iran-Contra affair. And we're going to go over some of that now. But what we really didn't get to talk about was this core role in a bank that had been front-started by Pakistani intelligence, but really the Central Intelligence Agency. Remember, that network was very much alive during the late 70s and early 80s when we were trying to topple the Soviets. Bin Laden was our open asset through that network. It's not, it's not a coincidence that there's reports that Bin Laden was protected by Pakistani military in a hotel on September 10th. It's not coincidence that we supposedly found him in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Yet Pakistan has never been mentioned really in the war on terror, at least not in the mainstream. So BCCI, this bank, is set up, and it is literally the high-level criminal den for money laundering. So how are they involved with this network and Adnan Khashoggi, somebody that Vicky Ward says Epstein worked for right in this time period?
Right. So in terms of Epstein, I think that he was involved to some extent with BCCI for the following reasons. So we know that after he left Bear Stearns in 1981, he began to do this activity in the world of shadow finance that he called being a financial bounty hunter. The way Epstein described that is that he was trying to hide money for powerful people and also find money for powerful people. And one of the only known clients he had during this time was Adnan Khashoggi, who, of course, prior to 1981 was recruited by the Mossad, and he was also a CIA asset. 1981 was also the first year that he did these arms deals. On behalf of, what eventually became Iran-Contra. He brokered the first of those arms deals through BCCI in 1981. And actually the BCCI, the official report on BCCI that was authored by two senators, John Kerry was one of them, said that Khashoggi was known as the banker, the quote-unquote banker of the arms dealers involved in Iran-Contra, and that for a lot of his transactions involving arms deals, he used BCCI. So why would someone like Khashoggi during this exact period of time be hiring someone who at that point was only experienced in the world of finance, like Jeffrey Epstein? It's also worth pointing out, too, that Epstein's previous employer that he had just left before he began to work for Khashoggi was Bear Stearns. And Bear Stearns, it was actually only revealed in 2011, several decades after BCCI collapsed in 1991. That Bear Stearns had a direct business relationship with BCCI, and that they were, serving as a broker to that bank, which I think is significant. Another thing, too, is that we know that during the 1980s, Epstein had claimed during the 1990s that he had worked previous decade for the CIA in some capacity. He made this claim. It was reported in a 2001 report in the UK newspaper, The Evening Standard, by Nigel Rosser. Which has now been scrubbed from the internet pretty much. But you can, I found some pieces of it and confirmed with people that had been interviewed by Rosser for that article that, in fact, it had mentioned this claim about Epstein in the past having claimed that he had worked for the CIA. Of course, Epstein would later go on to deny this, but there are some other CIA connections to CIA front companies, not just BCCI, that Epstein had, including Southern Air Transport, which we can get into in a little bit. But another thing about BCCI that I think is interesting, it's best known for being this money laundering bank, for being involved in, the drug trade and things like that. But one thing that really caught my attention in that, official U.S. Senate report on BCCI is that they were also involved in sex trafficking in the sense of that they would sell underage girls to powerful individuals in the United Arab Emirates as a way of currying favor.
Because you're almost glossing over it. When we say underage girls, the actual report says prepubescent girls who were had physical injury inflicted upon them. I don't want people to get this twisted and even try to justify it with 15, 16-year-old girls. And it's almost just a footnote in this very large report. And by the way, kudos to you for finding that. We're talking about a paragraph where it says, again, prepubescent girls for Saudi royals in the UAE that had harm inflicted upon them. It does not go into the extent of that harm, but yes, the fact that not only are they money laundering, they're involved in the trafficking trade of drugs and arms, but now we have underage sex trafficking as almost a footnote in this report. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I'm really glad you drive that home because, it really, considering the gravity of that crime, it really should have gotten a lot more coverage. But I think you can assume that the reason it didn't is because of the U.S. Coast relationship with the UAE and with the Saudis. If they had really dug deeper into the extent that, this bank was, pimping out these, as you said, prepubescent girls to these leaders as a way of currying favor. I mean, that would have, ostensibly led to some sort of repercussion in any, world where the system actually works as it's supposed to. But of course, it didn't. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to point that out in the context of, Jeffrey Epstein. Another thing I want to say, too, is that we know that after this period where Epstein was working for Khashoggi, that he had strong relationships with other arms dealers, including Douglas Leese, who's actually Sir Douglas Leese. He was knighted. He's a British arms dealer that worked with Khashoggi in the brokering of, I think it was in 1985, the Al Yamaha deal between BAE Systems in the UK and Saudi Arabia. And he worked with Khashoggi on that. So I think the fact that Epstein, was known to be working for Khashoggi, had these other connections, and then was also very well acquainted with someone like Douglas Leese. I think to me that suggests that he was involved in a lot of arms dealing in the moving of money through banks like BCCI with these sort of arms deals, that he had been involved in that sort of stuff for most of that period of time.
So now moving forward a little bit, but not really that much forward. when we're talking about Iran-Contra, and in particular the movement of drugs, Air America, we have that movie with Robert Downey Jr. and Mel Gibson from the 80s, largely overlooked, but I remember it as a kid. And it was basically the story of this front company for the CIA, an air transport company that was smuggling in, and it was long before them just using the drugs, by this way. They dated back, I believe, to at least the 60s, if not before that, being a CIA front company. So they changed their image and their name to Southern Air Transport. And why don't you tell us the connection of that?
Okay, so Southern Air Transport, as you said, it used to be directly owned by the CIA, but then it got sort of spun off into a private company when they tried to change their image a little bit and went through a couple different owners, but all of those owners had direct ties to the CIA, right? So at some point around 1994, Leslie Wexner of the Limited, who by that point had a very close personal relationship and business relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, began to negotiate the move, the relocation of Southern Air Transport from Miami, Florida to Columbus, Ohio, where the Limited is based. And during this period of time, we also know that Epstein was very involved in Wexner's business activities and was also involved with logistics for the Limited. So any sort of negotiation going on there to have, this airline relocate for the official purpose of transporting merchandise for the Limited, Epstein would have been involved as well. And what's interesting is that they sought out this company specifically. It's not like they tried to go after all these other different airlines. They wanted just this one airline. And Wexner pulled a bunch of strings in Ohio's government to basically get the Ohio government to offer this company this huge incentive package, most of it, obviously funded by taxpayers, to get this airline to relocate from Miami, Florida to Columbus. And, out of all the airlines in the United States, Wexner and Epstein choose Southern Air Transport, the very airline that's been involved, for decades, really, of drug running and smuggling a bunch of other stuff for the CIA. So, I think that's quite significant that happened.
And let me point out how they fleeced the public. This is standard pump and dump intelligence operations. Let me explain how this works. So he gets all the tax benefits, promises that they'll hire all these people. I mean, small-time crooks do it too. But they're going to hire all these people. They're going to build a new facility instead. When they come in, they get their tax money. They lay people off. They run it into the ground. The CEO runs off with $20+ million, and nothing is done. Now, you've pointed out the Wexner mega corporation connection, but I've recently done a story on Wexner and the Wexner Foundation and how they were working to have a favorable public post Saddam in the war on terror, and how this was
the Wexner analysis.
Yes, the Wexner analysis. And I want to be clear with people. This man is not just selling you lingerie with hot models around. Okay, that's not that's not what this guy is. All right, I get it. Everybody likes a hot chick. The way that they were getting these women in, they were playing to their dreams. You're going to be a model. You're going to be in the art world. We can get you behind the scenes in all these appealing places. Look at our power. But at the end of the day, what are they concerned about? The bigger money, the arms trade, foreign policy, full spectrum dominance in the Middle East. I mean, that paper is extremely telling. Favoring people's opinions by using women with children. I mean, the document's mind-blowing. And speaking of high-level corruption, there's also a bar connection that takes place around this same time. And I believe it's, who was it? Terry Lee?
Terry Reid.
Terry Reid.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me. So Terry Reid is one of the assets during this time period that's smuggling drugs. And, his revelations in his book about Bill Barr should really shake people to the core, because this isn't his first giddy-up rodeo with the Attorney General's office, okay? Bill Barr has had this position before. So why don't you get into that for a second?
Okay, well, this is going back to the 80s with Iran-Contra and Mina Airport, and how the Clintons, when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas, were tied into all of this. A lot of this drug running that involved Southern Air Transport, and people like, the dual CIA, DEA operative Barry Seal. Terry Reid was one of these people that was working under Oliver North, and presumably in connection with intelligence agencies. He wrote a book about his experiences, and he basically talked about how Bill Barr was covertly associated with the CIA during this period, had been sent to Arkansas sort of as the emissary of then CIA Director Bill Casey. Remember that before Bill Casey was director, Bill Barr had worked at the CIA as the CIA's liaison to Congress during the Church Committee, and basically stonewalled the Church Committee and kept them from getting a lot of information they were after. So anyway, Bill Barr was sent to Arkansas to meet with Bill Clinton on Bill Casey's behalf, and he basically delivered this message. Terry Reid was present at this meeting, and this is how he remembers it. He said that Bill Barr basically said that Bill Casey was willing to offer him the job he'd always wanted, that Clinton had always wanted, presumably the presidency, and saying that as long as Clinton didn't do anything stupid, that he could obtain that job, and then said something like, "We are the new covenant," talking to Clinton about Clinton and the CIA, and basically this network that, other people like Danny Casolaro, he would go on to call it the octopus, basically this network of CIA, intelligence, organized crime, and also some Israel connections, and the neocons and all of this, basically being this network so deeply involved in endless war and arms trafficking and drug trafficking, and also, as we know now, sex trafficking.
And remember, they made this Hollywood movie on Barry Seal, and originally it was going to be called Mina. It wasn't going to be called what the hell did they call it? It's going to kill me. It's killing me. But it's Tom Cruise. Man, I'll get to it in a second. But basically in it, they also wanted to put the scenes where 10 miles up the road, they were actually bringing Contras in and physically training them. In Mena, Arkansas, aside from the cocaine drug running, which I put in my film Invisible Empire, because his brother Roger actually got picked up in a sting during this, buying cocaine, and it is on tape saying, "Gotta get some for my brother. He's got a nose like a vacuum cleaner." And if anybody knows anything about this time period, this is when he's rolling with people like Jennifer Flowers around in the back of his limo doing blow everywhere. So, I mean, man, it's killing me. I can't remember the thing.
Well, it's okay. But if it doesn't, if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to bring up, too, that Hillary Clinton has a connection to all this stuff we've been talking about, too, really quick.
Yeah, please. Okay. Please go.
Great. So while Bill Clinton was governor, Hillary was a law partner at the Rose Law Firm. And she and some other prominent partners there that later had roles in the Clinton administration were involved with BCCI, specifically BCCI's movement into the United States, their purchase of First American bank shares, and their entry into the U.S. financial market. That was facilitated by Hillary Clinton, for example. And also some stuff, I think we talked about this last time, the Promise software, a company that sold Promise software to banks, basically, the bugged version, was also represented by Hillary Clinton's law firm, Rose Law Firm. So those are some pretty crazy connections, because that subsidiary that sold the Promise software that Hillary represented was called Systematics, and they also had some troubling connections to Israeli intelligence, that company did.
Absolutely. And, her partners at that law firm, Vince Foster and Webb Hubble, Vince Foster ends up dead. Both Vince Foster and Webb Hubble are alleged to have affairs with Clinton. Chelsea Clinton looks suspiciously like Webb Hubble when asked whether or not he was the biological father of Chelsea Clinton. He chose not to comment on the matter. And Webb Hubble is kind of, you can check that out. And he's kind of faded into the background as this fiction author that talks about the deep state and these kind of like Jack Reacher-esque storylines. It's very interesting. We'll get into Chelsea Clinton and her relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell, the Epstein associate, later on. Or we could do that now since we're so heavy into the Clintons. The fact is, they're connected on every level through the decades. So actually, before we get into that relationship, because, it took time to procure that, let's talk about the beginnings of the relationship, at least financially, of the Clintons and Jeffrey Epstein specifically.
Right. Okay. So, for anyone that was following the mainstream media coverage of this, it really seemed like the Bill Clinton-Epstein relationship only really began after Clinton left office. We know now that that is not true. Actually, by 1993, Epstein was a Clinton donor. He was attending donor dinners along with Ghislaine Maxwell of the White House Historical Association. Apparently, that relationship was brought about by this guy named A. Paul Prosperi, who was a friend of Bill Clinton's from college. He was very close to Epstein, actually, when Epstein was, quote unquote, imprisoned in Palm Beach, Florida. Prosperi visited him like dozens of times. So this is a guy that was very close to not just Bill Clinton, but Epstein for several decades, and apparently had no problem with what Epstein had been accused or convicted of, right? So, that was in 1993. Not long after that, Epstein makes several visits to the White House. He meets with the deputy chief of staff. And they have a couple meetings over the years. One interesting thing that pops up, though, is by 1995, Lynn Forrester, who is now Lynn Forrester de Rothschild and is a big-time Clinton backer going back decades. She, in this letter she sent to Bill Clinton, she says, "It was so nice to run into you at Senator Ted Kennedy's home. And I only had, my 15 seconds of access to talk to you about two really important things. And those two really important things," she says, are Jeffrey Epstein and currency stabilization. So that's very interesting that Lynn Forrester was spending her, very important 15 seconds of access to talk to the president of the United States about Jeffrey Epstein specifically and currency stabilization. And this is in 1995, right? This is the same year that Southern Air Transport relocates to Columbus, Ohio, on behalf of Epstein and Wexner. And it's also the same year that Epstein begins to occupy the New York penthouse that Wexner bought for him, basically, and, equipped with spy equipment, and appears to have begun the sexual blackmail operation that he was later arrested for. He appears to have begun that around this period. So it's interesting that he's coming up in such an interesting conversation, I guess you could call it, between one of Clinton's top donors and top political backers, that they're having in a private situation. And also the fact that it's Epstein and currency stabilization together, I think, is significant, because Epstein often bragged about how he was so good at playing currency markets. And he claimed that a lot of his billionaire consulting firm, where Wexner was the only known client, that he was using that money, he was putting it into currency markets and things like that. So seeing Jeffrey Epstein alongside currency stabilization during that period of time, I think is really nuts, especially when you consider that the media attention of the Epstein-Clinton relationship, it only starts when he left office, but we have all this evidence that they definitely knew each other well before then.
And let's stop there, because I do want to keep this along the same timeline. You've already mentioned the Promise software, which was used to bug numerous people. I mean, when you get back into the later article we'll talk about this Track Trace Database Society, we don't really know how far it's gone and really its offshoots have gone. But let's get into the fact that Netanyahu was said to have, prior to the scandal of Lewinsky, tapes of their phone sex conversations, and that he was actually lobbying to get Jonathan Pollard, the American citizen, the person who was born in Texas, who was caught as a Mossad agent, even though they disavowed what he was doing. This is a guy who wasn't born in Israel, who actually was U.S. naval intelligence, got caught, and back then when we cared about espionage, he was to be imprisoned for the rest of his life. I'd like to point out that although Clinton did not pardon him, as was suggested, he did end up pardoning somebody else. And at the time, George Tenet, because it looks like during that time period, Pollard was caught in 86 and was convicted in 87. They probably had dirt on that original Bush clique, the Cheneys, the Rumsfelds, Wolfowitz, all those guys that were already in this. And you talk about COG later, which I want to get into as well. You've got so much great information in there. Pollard,
Thanks.
Pollard isn't given that. There is someone traded for Pollard, and this information eventually comes out. It's not really clear whether or not that was the aid of Mossad, but they certainly had that information. Pollard was let go 2 years ago. It might have been 2015, and is now lobbying to not only be free, which he is, but to be able to go live in Israel. This is the madness of our foreign policy, and really the ineptness of the public to even care about this stuff. They're so apathetic. So why don't you get into that whole mess and really that kind of like spy trade?
Yeah, well, it is a total mess. So basically, what happened in 1997, there's a couple things that went on in this year that are relevant. So the first one is that Amdocs, this Israeli telecommunications company with ties to Israeli intelligence, they were contracted along with Bell Atlantic to reinstall all the telephone lines in the White House in 1997, and also of several other important government facilities in Washington, D.C. that same year. Somehow, within less than a year, Netanyahu obtains the phone calls it's basically phone sex calls between Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, in attempts to use that as leverage over Clinton at the Y Plantation talks to, as you said, try and get Clinton to, pardon Jonathan Pollard, and he is unsuccessful, though Clinton does try to do it, but he meets resistance from George Tenet, who threatens to resign and make a huge scandal out of it if he actually goes forward. And there is a lot of corroborating evidence about Netanyahu trying to use this as leverage over Clinton. It seems possible that the pressure was really applied in 2001 in Clinton's last day of office, not to pardon Pollard, but to pardon Mark Rich, who was a Mossad operative who was, charged in the 1980s. Was the founder of Glencore, and involved in a lot of stuff going way back in oil and commodities trading. And actually, it was a lot more people besides Netanyahu that were applying the pressure with the Mark Rich pardon. It was also Michael Steinhardt, who's a member of the Mega Group that we talked about last time, and also Ehud Barak, another, prime minister of Israel, who actually was heard by several other Israeli officials, heard yelling at Bill Clinton, telling him he had to pardon Mark Rich. So that's pretty wild. But I would like to say something about Amdocs again. Amdocs, between 1997 and 1998, it was found that they had a lot of the phone lines, the phone calls that were going through these lines that they had reinstalled in the White House and these other facilities. They were transferred to an Amdocs facility in St. Louis. And that facility had a direct line to Tel Aviv and was found to be sending a lot of these calls, recordings of these calls directly to Israel, and nothing was done to this guy, the Amdocs official that was caught doing this. So I think that's really, really telling. And also, there's another company that was involved in U.S. government espionage.
Converse?
Also during this time, Converse Infosys, which is now Verint Inc. And actually, after they were caught spying so extensively on the U.S. government, the NSA contracted Verint, formerly Converse Infosys, to install backdoors into the entire U.S. communication system, telecommunications system for the NSA. So to assume that a company founded by Israeli intelligence officers wouldn't keep that backdoor for themselves, I personally, based on what we know about the Promise software and what happened with Amdocs and also what happened with this company before, I think that would be quite naive to assume they wouldn't keep that for themselves.
And let's just stop for a second, because one of the highlights in my Israeli operative section of Fabled Enemies, I recently did a watch along chapter by chapter on the anniversary of 9/11, was the fact that this network that did involve Amdocs and Converse prior to 9/11, there were about 60 or 70 people who had already been rounded up and arrested. Then you have the people that were detained on 9/11, and then in the following months, we had up to 140 actually arrested in this ring. It was almost a pure media blackout. These people were never charged, and Alan Dershowitz somehow negotiated not only their release, but their release back to Israel, and it's never talked about.
It wasn't only Dershowitz, though, but remember, Dershowitz is an Epstein friend, right? But it was also Michael Chertoff was Assistant Attorney General during that period of time. His mother worked for the Mossad in Operation Magic Carpet.
Because I know you're going to want to get into, maybe this is where we kind of leapfrog into the next article since we're almost halfway anyway. But Chertoff, as the Assistant Attorney General, Larry Klayman, who was representing Robert Wright, Barry Kermody, the FBI agents that were trying to blow the whistle that Khalid al-Mihdhar and others had been protected by the FBI, the guys that were trying to blow the whistle on the Saudi funding through Yassin Qadi and others prior to 9/11 through an operation called Vulgar Betrayal, says, hey, These guys want to make this information known to you. And Chertoff said, you know what? We've had enough conspiracy theories. We don't need any more. That's a real deal thing. And that guy, that's the guy. They said, you know what? Why don't you head up Homeland Security? We're creating the Stasi in America. Go for it, Mr. Chertoff. So please continue with his other intelligence ties and the fact his mother may have been Israeli intelligence.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, his mother was Livia Eisen. You can read on her obituary online in the New York Star Ledger. It's from like 1997 or 1998. It says that she worked with the Mossad on Operation Magic Carpet, which was a Mossad operation, I think, in the 1960s, but it was super secretive and wasn't revealed until after it had been done. And she worked on this airline that was had this connection to Mossad, not just through Operation Magic Carpet, but other operations. So that's pretty significant. And as is the fact that when Chertoff was, nominated for these positions, he was never questioned about his family ties to Israeli intelligence, which, in any other, case, I think that would have been a major question. But also when he was assistant attorney general, it's worth pointing out that the attorney general during that time, also John Ashcroft, when he went into the private sector and became a lobbyist, basically, after leaving his post in the Bush administration, his first main client was Israel's government. So that's another tie in there.
And you know what? This is a good time to move into, we probably didn't even cover a tenth of what's in this article right here, okay, guys. So listen, I'm telling you now, you need to go read these. Just as I passionately told you guys before, follow her on Twitter. Please read this article. It's not the Cliff Notes version. Actually, I didn't even get into Danny Casolaro, the octopus. The fact that you link to a letter where it implies, it follows his whole, I actually read the letter. It follows the last time he was seen in a bar, the fact that he was probably taken, interrogated, drugged, and then cut up. Those laceration photos you put in are credible. It's a must watch. But since we're getting into technology, since we're talking about Israeli intelligence, American intelligence, it's time to talk about Carbine, Black Cube, and their significance in this case. Especially, I can't wait to get to the Peter Thiel stuff. So essentially, explain, now that we talked about Amdocs, we talked about Converse, we talked about Promise, this seems to be the next level track trace database software of this network. Because I'm not going to call them anything. This isn't all of Israeli intelligence. This isn't all of American intelligence. This is that cabal that we've been talking about since even prior to the 80s. But I think you can really hammer home in the 80s with the Iran-Contra, with those Oliver North revelations. Like you said, the UAE sex trafficking. This is something that's been going on for a while. So out of the gates, describe to people the significance of Carbine and Black Cube in this saga.
Okay, so there's two separate things. I think I'll unpack them separately if that's okay, and
Sure.
Start with Carbine 911 first. So Carbine 911 is this company that markets itself as an emergency call handling system, basically to be installed on the electronic infrastructure for emergency service providers throughout the country. There's this push right now at the federal level, at Congress, to create next generation 911, because right now 911 call centers are managed, locally at like the state or even local level. It really depends on what part of the country you're in. And there's been all this media coverage about how old all those systems are getting and the need to update them and create this new thing called next generation 911 or NG 911. The idea to have basically the same company or software installed on all 911 systems throughout the country and have them all interconnected at the national level. So all 911 systems in the state of, Connecticut will be connected to those that California and every other state, basically. So the company that is closest to all of the lobbying groups pushing for this in DC right now is actually not an American company. It's an Israeli company called Carbine 911. It used to be called Reporti. The chairman of the board and the main investor in this company is Ehud Barak, who I mentioned earlier with the pardon of Mark Rich, but he's the former prime minister of Israel. He's also the former head of Israeli military intelligence. He's been in the news lately, of course, because of his close ties to Jeffrey Epstein. And Jeffrey Epstein also donated at least, probably more, but donated at least, invested at least $1 million in this company. Another main investor in this company is Peter Thiel of PayPal and Palantir and all of those companies. And beyond that, we have on their board of advisors, we have another Palantir ex-employee that used to be head of the Trump DOD transition team, or DOD Department of Defense, right? We also have Michael Chertoff, who we just talked about. And we also have on the board of directors, we have the former commander of Israeli Military Intelligence Unit 8200. We have one of Trump's top 2020 re-election campaign donors, Elliot Tawil, who's a New York real estate developer. And then there are the three co-founders of Carbine 911, who were, two of them are former Unit 8200 Israeli military intelligence. One of them, prior to creating Carbine 911, had worked for Black Cube. She recently just left Carbine 911, now works for Eric Prince's company, Frontier Services Group. And the other guy used to work for Netanyahu's office in Israel. So those are the main players involved in this company. But if you look into the company, and I won't go in, spend a lot of time on the specifics of the software and all of this, but basically, it's for smartphones. This company, if it's installed in your 911 system, anytime you call them, it doesn't matter if you have the special Carbine app installed on your phone, you call 911 and Carbine's software, even if you don't have the app installed, can extract literally anything it wants from your phone and store it. And they plan to store as much all of the data they acquire and use it not just to analyze your past and present behavior, but also your future behavior.
And let's stop you there, because I think a lot of people are going to say, well, that's just in the future. But Carbine is already in place in places like Mexico and Ukraine. All right, so this isn't like coming. This is here.
No, it's used in the U.S. too. It's already used in a couple counties in Georgia and I think in some other states, and they're pushing for it to be rolled out nationwide. I don't think it's any coincidence it has all these Trump administration ties at a time when there's all this heavy congressional lobbying to push through Next Generation 911, with the obvious company being this one, Carbine 911, the fact that it's already installed on several of these companies before Epstein, or in several counties, sorry. And before Epstein was arrested, it was basically, there was this huge pro Carbine 911 media blitz on places like Fox News and a bunch of other outlets, saying like, this is the answer. We recently partnered with Cisco Systems for smart city functionality. They'll be hooked up to, if you live in a smart city or whatever, Carbine 911 will have access to street lamps and whatever else is connected to that. And the vision of Carbine 911 is for people not to make 911 calls anymore, but your devices will make it for you. Whatever ends up triggering, those phone calls to be made to authorities, one can imagine how that could be misused. For example, especially if you have things like street lamps in your car and things like that spying on you. But I don't want to get too...
No, let's stop right there, because you said something really important, spying on you. And I want to point out that we don't do a lot of Chinese fear-mongering here. But when the Chi-Coms are actually doing something and using software much like Carbine to spy on specific groups of people, we have to point out that this is next level. Because let's be honest, the United States of America are no altar boys. In fact, you put quotes in your articles from 92, from 95, early to mid 90s, that Promise had already started building a main core, and that Oliver North had actually already admitted that they were following dissidents in the U.S., and that some of the whistleblowers could not believe how minute it was that they were tracking, tracing, and databasing their activities. Now we're on a whole nother level, and this is the type of software that's out there. So why don't you reflect on the growth of this type of surveillance from the 90s into what we have today?
So while talking about main core, before I get into that, let me go back to Carbine for a second.
Sure.
So there was an app basically for the Chinese equivalent of 911 installed throughout, I think, several regions of China. And it was marketed as the same way Carbine 911 is being marketed, as a way to improve emergency response and things like that. But what the Chinese ended up using it for was mass surveillance, and to profile people based on their personal conversations, where they went, who they talked to, and to divide them into all these different categories, including like their religious affiliation, how they felt politically, and things like that. So now what you brought up about main core, Main Core appears to have begun being created in either around 1983 or so, as part of the continuity of government program that Oliver North was involved with. Why he was also doing this Iran-Contra stuff. So Main Core was basically at that time a list of potential troublemakers, was how it was described, potential dissidents. And you could basically have just been anyone that ever refused to pay your taxes at some point, or refused, or that attended a political protest. It was very easy to get on that list, and that list, it still exists today. Of course, it has changed a lot since then. The last round of reporting on it was actually over 10 years ago. It was in 2008 by Christopher Ketchum, really, and Tim Shorrock, in a couple different outlets. But at that point, it was estimated by officials that these journalists spoke to that there were about 8 million Americans on this list. By then, we can assume that it's a lot bigger. The name Main Core, though, basically means that it is the main core of all of the surveillance acquired on American citizens by all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. So whatever the CIA, the NSA, or the FBI has on you, or any of these other agencies, it all goes into this Main Core thing. And it's all, it's all this bulk data, so it's really hard to sort through. So what PROMIS did originally was help people, they type in the name of a person, are they a dissident, or bring up all the dissidents and make, that information easy to consume, allow an average person or any person in government basically to make sense of all this bulk data. So today, that company that would do what PROMIS did then for Main Core is Palantir. And we know that Palantir is very involved with pre-crime and also very involved with intelligence agencies. It's a contractor to all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, also the military. And of course, Peter Thiel was involved in Carbine 911, which, as I just mentioned, has sort of these pre-crime elements as well. So a lot to be concerned about there. A lot of this information that's in Main Core, it has stuff like your financial transactions. And now we're seeing stuff like, with Edward Snowden coming out saying everyone's on the list. There's been speculation that maybe he is actually talking about Main Core. It's really hard to know at this point. We do know that there is a special subset of people on Main Core that are targeted to be potentially round up the event of a national crisis event. And we know that national crisis events, based on how Oliver North had defined them in the 80s, could have just been something as simple as widespread national opposition to a U.S. military intervention abroad. So basically, if there's war with Iran, for example, and the American people say no way, that is, a potential trigger to put this continuity of government program and martial law and, rounding up people into action, which is very terrifying to think about. On another level, we do know that continuity of government aspects of it, not the full program, aspects of it went live after 9/11, and that this subset of people considered dissidents were basically targeted for increased surveillance to be spied on more, basically, after 9/11, and that Main Core was basically the guide about who to spy on.
And continuity of government does exist. It is the shadow government. It was revamped in the 80s through the National Program Office, through that, Reagan, Bush era, that a lot of this corruption kind of came into formation. And now, speaking of, intelligence and Black Cube and Israel, for instance, you have Netanyahu that's been quoted several times saying, look, all these tech companies, all these sub-intelligence companies, they're run by our ex-intelligence officers, whether they were Mossad or 802, et cetera. They have some kind of training. And in the case of Black Cube itself, Ehud Barak personally put them on to Weinstein prior to these articles coming out where they investigated and harassed people who were his victims. I mean, this is reality. And believe me, Black Cube is very capable of what they do, and they're far from the only one of these organizations. In fact, when you talk about the technology companies, these people are then encouraged to basically create their own companies with their own capital and their own means for plausible deniability, but then always still be attached to this network. Why don't you describe how that works?
Okay, well, a good example of that is Black Cube, right? So it was actually acknowledged in Israel in 2012 that there was this new effort among Israeli intelligence agencies, basically the Mossad and military intelligence, to outsource a lot of activities that used to be done in-house. And the way they decided to do this was to create private companies. And they would basically take the people in these intelligence agencies that were in charge of a particular project, and they would say, make your startup or make your private company, and continue the project that way. And we know from Israeli media reports that Black Cube was one of these companies, that it was spun out of the Mossad basically to be a privatized Mossad, which is why it's no secret that, the chairman of their board was Meir Dagan, the longtime head of Mossad until his death in 2016, was the head of Black Cube. And a lot of its the people that work for it are ex-Israeli military intelligence or, ex-Mossad, basically. And they conduct several different types of activities. They do things on behalf of people like Harvey Weinstein. They do things on behalf of corporations like corporate espionage. But they also have a political section. We know, for example, that they were trying to sabotage the Iran nuclear deal by trying to get information on these sexual activities and finances of the main people in the U.S. That were negotiating the Iran nuclear deal for the Obama administration on that side.
And let me stop you there because I want to just point, we only have so much time. I want to point out that, we always think, especially with Epstein, that this sexual blackmail has to do with underage girls. But as you point out in this article, with his association with a lot of these tech giants, Elon Musk among them, it's not always underage girls. It's, hey, they're using drugs. These are their sexual proclivities. Perhaps they're cheating
Anything
on
that can
their
be used
wife.
as blackmail is used as blackmail. The pedophile sex blackmail, that's a very specific type of blackmail, but the net is much wider than that. I'm glad you brought up Epstein in Silicon Valley for a second, because Epstein, just a year before his recent arrest and death or whatever, basically said, I have all this damaging information on people in Silicon Valley, including, as you said, their drug use and their sexual, fantasies and tendencies and things like that. So it's worth considering, did he use that to advance, for example, the ambitions of Carbine 911 or, Israeli military intelligence interests in Silicon Valley? There's actually this guy who is a former executive producer for CBS News who's been reporting on some aspects of the Epstein-Israeli intelligence connection. And he said that he was able to confirm independently with a couple sources that Epstein was connected to Israeli military intelligence directly. I think that personally had to do with the Silicon Valley aspects, based on what we know about his involvement with Carbine 911 and some other things, for example, and his, claim to have all this leverage over Silicon Valley people specifically. And in the last years of his life, he was trying to rebrand. We know this for a fact. He was trying to rebrand as a tech investor and get involved in a lot of high tech type stuff. So I think, that there's a lot of overlap there between the stuff we're talking about. And also with Black Cube, I said that Black Cube was one of these companies that was spun off. There were a ton of these companies. Black Cube is just one of the only ones that's been acknowledged to have been created this way. There are numerous others. There was one Israeli media report that talked about a tech company specifically that was just like this, where employees admitted that they blurred the line about working for Israeli intelligence and their commercial activity. Blur the line. That sounds like, their commercial activities are influenced by their connections to Israeli intelligence. I mean, that's a pretty, it's an admission basically that this company is up to something. And it's really interesting too, that Israeli media report, all media in Israel has to pass by the Israeli military censor. The Israeli military censor took out the name of that company because it could threaten ongoing or past, Israeli operations or government operations. So I think that's really significant that they cut out this name, because they also admitted this company that they wouldn't name does business abroad. Right. So who is that company? Why has no one tried to find out who that is? I think, that's really telling.
And you know what? Let's segue that, because you also have a section in this article where you discuss Israel gets its own In-Q-Tel. And for those that are unaware of what In-Q-Tel is, it was this CIA front company that invested in all these other tech companies and basically sprouted sub-companies that were controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency. And Israel did essentially the same thing. Why don't you describe how that occurred?
Yeah, well, it's much more recent than In-Q-Tel is, but they made their own venture capital fund for investing in tech companies. It's called Libertad Ventures. And they have a really creepy, promo trailer for it. You can look up on YouTube. But basically, they say it was modeled after In-Q-Tel, and they only sponsor 5 companies a year The things they are interested in are pretty interesting. It's stuff like natural language processing, personality profiling of people based on their online activity, a lot of very Orwellian type stuff. What's really alarming about this, in my opinion, is that it's not just focused on Israeli companies. U.S. companies can also be sponsored by Libertad or any company abroad. But unlike In-Q-Tel, Libertad Ventures, this Mossad venture capital fund, does not disclose who they invest in. They keep it a secret. And In-Q-Tel doesn't do that. In-Q-Tel says, yeah, we invested in that. Usually In-Q-Tel is one of several investors in a company. For example, In-Q-Tel was responsible for funding companies like Google and Palantir and a lot of these other big tech companies we know today. So what's interesting is that the Mossad doesn't say who they're investing in. And also there seems to be something off about what they request of these companies. They claim they just want access to the product during research and development. And then after that, this special technology they're investing in can be sold to anyone, including enemy states of Israel. It doesn't really sound like Israeli intelligence policy to me based on historical precedent. I honestly think, based on what we have been talking about today, that it's quite possible that there may be a back door or something like that inserted into the software during research and development, and then they're sold all over the world. Because, I mean, if you think about the Mossad, for example, financing some type of high-tech software, and then they're okay with that software being sold to, I don't know, Iran's intelligence agency or some state that's like well known to be at odds with Israel. I don't really think that would make a lot of sense unless, of course, they had a back door into it, and then they would, of course, be okay with it.
All right, so we got about 10 minutes left. There are things we didn't even get to. I mean, you bring up the fact that Clinton was on Air Fuck One with Ron Burkle and probably procured sex there. We didn't bring up the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell attended Chelsea Clinton's wedding and went on vacation with her. What did we miss in these last two articles, in this last 10 minutes, before we let you tell people where to find you, Mint Press? Guys, you got to support her work. Follow her on Twitter. I mean, her stuff is great. Share this stuff. But what do you think is the most important thing that we missed in this hour?
Okay. Well, actually, I think it might have to do with Carbine and what we were talking about there. So basically, Carbine is marketing itself as a solution to mass shootings. And it's not the only Israeli intelligence linked company in the U.S. doing this. There is another one just like Carbine called Gabriel, whose board of directors includes people like the deputy director of the Mossad, former director of Shin Bet, Israel's domestic intelligence agency, and a lot of other troubling connections that basically will have access to all of your smartphone data and also have cameras inside places like schools and churches, all these other community centers that will go back to its network. And like I said, it's all tied into the Mossad. And they have openly admitted that their business model is based on there being more mass shootings in the United States. So it's basically, modeled on, more fear among the American public about mass shootings. And this is being marketed specifically this way as a way to solve the mass shooting problem that goes beyond the gun debate, basically avoiding the partisan gridlock in Capitol Hill as a way to do something about this mass shooting solution. And this very creepily dovetails with what Trump has promoted since the last few mass shootings, this where he said it's time to detect mass shooters before they strike, and he called on tech companies to do that. To do this sort of pre-crime stuff based on what you say on what people say online and post online, and things like that. And all of this company that's being developed by people connected to this network we're talking about are doing that very stuff. And so it's very troubling to consider that, the Trump is now promoting this sort of pre-crime solution to gun shootings. And actually, there's a push that a policy that's being promoted specifically by Ivanka Trump and apparently the Kushners that Trump has allegedly, according to the Washington Post, if you want to believe them, that Trump has been sold on this concept of creating this new government agency called HARPA that would basically be the health version of DARPA, aimed at identifying mental illness in people based on their basically by spying on them, their online activity, and by spying on you through Amazon Echo and Google Home, and all of that
which
stuff.
Which they're all going to do.
Things like that.
Because again, I really like to go to the Connor Betts case because it was cut and dry within 12 hours of the incident. We saw all the footage. The guy lasted 30 seconds. He was all meted up. We found antidepressants, cocaine, alcohol in his body. He had threatened to kill and rape classmates in a list that was so severe he was expelled from school for a year. When they didn't tell the school that he was coming back, a third of the students left that school that year because they didn't want to be part of it. He was into decapitation. He was into murder. He showed all the signs of being a shooter. There would be no need to spy on this guy. He shouldn't have had a gun in the first place. That's why these things make me utterly sick, Whitney, because it is. It's about the restriction of not only our ability to move and purchase, etc., but the restriction of our thought globally. I mean, truly thought criminals that can see into a window that we're not even aware of through algorithms in this little smart device in our pocket.
Right. Well, I think it's no coincidence that the FBI recently, leaked by accident. I don't think it was by accident, but they leaked this report that conspiracy theorists are a domestic terror threat. I think what we have just been talking about in this pre-crime push and things like that, sort of coming not that long after, this new domestic terror threat of conspiracy theorists, I think that is really troubling for everyone that thinks outside the box, is a skeptic of the official story on really anything. And I think that so much of this has been in place for so long that we're just going to, we're really just a couple, maybe even just one, mass shooting or crisis event away from them trying to make the stuff go live. So it's really important to get, this information out and show these connections and have people, protest this crap because it's Orwellian and it's a nightmare. And this is not, America, the land of the free. This is the ultimate extension of what began after 9/11 of totally reducing our civil liberties and taking it away and creating this surveillance police state. And this is, one of those last nails in the coffin. If they get to push that through, have all your electronic devices spy on you, and then put that through an artificial intelligence algorithm to determine if you could be a threat to either the government or someone else or anything like that. The potential for abuse is insane.
Whitney Webb of mintpress.com. I've got 2 super chats, and they're pretty short, and they're directed towards you, so I'm just going to ask you them. Do you think there's anything important to focus on the Rusty Shackelford videos? And is there any connection between Epstein and George Clooney, who is controlled by the CIA?
The George Clooney one I haven't looked into, but I know he's really involved in pushing for regime change and with white helmets and all that sort of stuff. But I haven't seen any connection to him specifically.
Me neither.
Rusty Shackelford is the guy that does the drone footage of the island, right?
Yeah. She's asking, is there anything in those videos that has caught your eye?
Right. So there's been the video of the guy that looked like Epstein after Epstein was dead. And a lot of people think that he, was extracted from prison. Honestly, when we pull out the whole intelligence thing, I just want to say that anything is really possible, whether he was killed in prison or extracted from prison. I think all of that ultimately comes down to how important he was to this network. If he was sort of a small guy that they viewed as expendable, they would have just offed him. If he was actually much higher level than we have been led to believe, then he would have been extracted and potentially on that island. I mean, it's really hard to know until, more information or there's whistleblowers or more footage. I mean, who knows? But, I'm not going to say 100% one way or the other based on some drone footage. But I think it raises important questions. I guess that'll be my answer.
Well, Whitney Webb, you are more than invited back on this show for any reason, any article. You are great to have. My audience absolutely loves you. I love chatting with you, and I hope to see you in the future. People need to support your work over at mintpress.com. Is there any way else they can support you?
You can follow me on Twitter. You can donate to me via PayPal. You just have to email me or DM me for my PayPal email, or you can donate to Mint Press. We have a Patreon. You can also go to the donate tab on the mintpressnews.com website. All of my work is published there currently, so you can follow me and support me through there.
Well, thank you once again, Whitney Webb. She's awesome. We're going to have her back on hopefully in the near future. Folks, if you want to support my work, remember I am a documentary Filmmaker, Loose Change Final Cut, Fabled Enemies, Invisible Empire 8, New World Order Defined, and Shade the Motion Picture, all free on this channel. Thumbs this video up, share it with others. A plethora of information. You need to read her articles. They are over the top. Spend 2 hours plus, 3 hours, 4 hours researching what she has to say in these 2 articles. They're amazing. I'm doing 3 to 7 videos a day. If you're not subscribed, if you're not part of the Burmese Brigade, if you haven't rung the bell for notifications, now's the time to do it. And if you can, $5, $10, $15, it means the world to me. There is no subscribe star. There is no secret info. I don't have a Patreon. There's no private Skype sessions. There's nothing but love in my heart. And I love you guys. And if you can donate, thank you. But any way you look at it, I will see you on the flip side.